Good afternoon and welcome to my lecture recital for my Doctor of Musical Arts degree at USC. Today I'm going to be presenting on Mikhail Pletnev's transcriptions of concert suites from two ballets by Tchaikovsky, Sleeping Beauty and the Nutcracker. Mikhail Pletnev arranged both of these for solo piano, and I'll be first presenting a discussion of these works, and then following that will be a performance of both concert suites. Mikhail Pletnev, the transcriber, was born in 1957 and rose to international fame when he won the gold medal in the 1974 Tchaikovsky competition as a pianist. And he also has had a major career as a conductor. He founded the Russian National Orchestra in 1990 as the first orchestra that was privately owned and run in Russia since the Russian Revolution. As an arranger and transcriber, Pletnev's other work also includes a version of Prokofiev's Cinderella for two pianos, as well as movements from Rodion Shchedrin's opera Anna Karenina. Pletnev's concert suites fit somewhere between two extremes in the tradition of piano transcription. On the one hand, there are the more literal transcriptions that seek to follow the score as accurately and as faithfully as possible and not to change anything if at all possible. For example, Brahms's transcription of the D minor chaconne by Johann Sebastian Bach for solo violin. Brahms transcribed this piece for violin to piano. The transcription is incredibly literal, and essentially every note is preserved from the violin score to the piano by Brahms. He even has the pianist play the entire piece with just the left hand as a kind of imitation of the violin. On the other extreme would be the more free and transformative approach to transcription. For example, Liszt, in his many paraphrases and reminiscences of operas, in which Liszt takes various themes from the operas but pushes them all together into one single work, which is not meant to represent any particular moment from the opera, but rather Liszt's own interpretation of that opera. So between those two extremes, there's a wide middle. Also to be noted is the example of Busoni, who also transcribed, like Brahms, the D minor chaconne for violin, transcribed it to solo piano. But Busoni's transcription is quite different than Brahms. Busoni's transcription, while leaving the form of the piece intact, Busoni adds many effects to enliven and enhance what is in the original piece. So there are many more notes in the piano version than there are in the original violin version. And Busoni was aiming to express what he saw as the inner meaning of the work without aiming to express literally note for note what Bach wrote on the violin and just moving it over to the piano. However, Busoni does leave the form of the piece intact. So unlike Liszt, who totally creates a new form from the themes of the operas that he writes paraphrases for, Busoni leaves the form intact. We'll see that Pletnev's philosophy combines elements from each of these approaches. On the one hand, there are moments when Pletnev aims to be very literal and to capture exactly the letter of the score as it appears in the original orchestra and to bring that to the piano. There are also a couple select moments when Pletnev veers, not entirely, but veers somewhat in the direction of Liszt by rearranging the order of certain events in the music and creating movements from different selections in the ballet. But usually Pletnev is more in the Busoni stream, where the form of the piece remains more or less intact, but a lot of the effects are enhanced, or various adaptations have to be reached in order to move what is written for the orchestra over to the piano. So I would classify Pletnev's approach in the following way. The form of the pieces is mostly intact. There are a couple places where it is flexible. However, Pletnev does not go so far as to create entirely new sections the way that Liszt does in his transcriptions. Second thing I would categorize Pletnev's philosophy as is that he is very creative in recreating orchestral color on the piano. So it doesn't always translate into a one-to-one relationship note for note, but Pletnev finds alternative ways of creating effects that match what the orchestra does without copying it. Before I begin a discussion of some of the details of Pletnev's transcription, I first want to give a brief synopsis of the story of each ballet, and then where the movements that Pletnev chooses happen in the ballet, so that you understand some of the context in the story. Sleeping Beauty takes place in 17th century France in the court of a fictional king, Florestan, who has a newborn daughter, Aurora. Aurora is cursed by the evil fairy Carabosse, who says that she will one day prick her finger on a spindle and never awake. The good Lilac Fairy intervenes and says it will actually be only 100 years of sleep, not death, after which she will be kissed by a young prince and awakened. Aurora then grows up, and on her 20th birthday, she pricks her finger, and the whole castle with her falls into a deep sleep for 100 years. Prince Florimond, 100 years later, comes and awakens her with a kiss, and then they are married. This story is no doubt familiar to many of you. Of the movements that Pletnev selects for inclusion in his concert suite, here's where each one comes from. The first is the prologue, which introduces the contrast between Carabasse's theme, which is more chromatic, and the diatonic Lilac Fairy's theme. The Dance of the Pages, the second piece, happens near the beginning of the ballet at the court of King Florestan at Princess Aurora's birth. 3 and 4 are a vision and dance scene with Prince Florimond, where he imagines that he sees Princess Aurora in a vision, but does not yet do so in reality. 6 and 9 are Puss in Boots and Little Red Riding Hood, which are 2 fairy tale characters who appear at the end of the ballet after Princess Aurora has been awakened. Number 7 is a gavotte. Number 5 is the Sober Fairy, who is one of the guests at Aurora's birth. So the order that Pletnev chooses for his movements does not exactly follow the storyline of the ballet perfectly, but is rearranged somewhat for musical purposes. Number 10 and 11 are an adagio, a piece for Prince Florimond and Princess Aurora, which is perhaps the climax of the whole suite. And then finally, the last finale, number 11, is their wedding dance. I'll also briefly describe the synopsis for the Nutcracker, which also I'm sure is very familiar to everybody. Clara receives a Nutcracker toy from her uncle Drosselmeyer. The Nutcracker toy comes to life and battles against the Mouse King. Clara throws her slipper at the Mouse King, and the Nutcracker is then able to defeat him. The Nutcracker then takes Clara through the snow and into the land of the sweets, where they meet the Sugar Plum Fairy. After all of this, Clara awakes and is safely home. The movements that Pletnev selects are very typical. He has the March of the Nutcracker Toys, the first piece, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy's Prince, which is the third piece, the Tarantella. Piece number 4, the intermezzo, is Clara and the Nutcracker's journey through the snow after the Mouse King is defeated. Then we have 5 and 6, Trepak, also known as the Russian dance, and Tea, also known as the Chinese dance, which are some of the sweets encountered in the land of the sweets. And then finally, the grand pas de deux between the Sugar Plum Fairy and her prince in the land of the sweets, which concludes Pletnev's Nutcracker arrangement. Now I would like to look in more detail at some selections which show the kinds of decisions Pletnev made as a transcriber. I'm going to look at 7 examples which show the ways in which Pletnev creatively reconstructed these pieces to be suitable not just for piano, but also for the concert hall. It's important to remember that these are transcriptions not just from orchestra to piano, but also from ballet to concert music. The priorities which govern these different media have to be negotiated by Pletnev when he moves from one to the other. So there's really 2 transcription processes happening, from orchestra to piano and from ballet to concert hall. The first example is from the Nutcracker, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. These examples will move in order from most literal to most free, showing the range of different options that Pletnev takes in different moments, depending on what is suitable. This first example shows Pletnev striving to match the orchestral texture as closely as possible. We'll see that the bass clarinet entrance in measure 10 is in quarter notes, while the strings are in eighth notes. And this creates an issue that there are 2 different note lengths. And Pletnev's solution is to match that exactly in his piano arrangement. Let's listen to the orchestra first. So we see that the bass clarinet has long held notes, and this is maintained by Pletnev in his piano arrangement. So we see here that Pletnev aims to recreate, in this instance, the orchestral texture as closely as possible, even where it creates additional difficulties for the piano. Second example comes from the Gavotte in Sleeping Beauty. This is surprising because Pletnev follows the orchestration more or less that Tchaikovsky uses, but he does a little bit of what I will call reorchestration, where he changes the entrance of the bassoon entrance in order to create more variety. So here Pletnev is following but exercising some creative discretion in where he wants the bassoon entrance to enter. Now, in the piano version, Pletnev decides to have the eighth notes in the bassoon enter at a later point. So where the star is where the bassoon entrance should be, but it actually doesn't happen until later in measure 14. This is Pletnev's way of creating more variety out of the texture. I would call that Pletnev's reorchestration or reconfiguring of when the instruments enter. Third example is an even more substantial change in the march of the Nutcracker's Toy Soldiers. The passage is very striking in the original orchestral arrangement, but very awkward if translated literally to the piano. Pletnev comes up with an adaptation of this upward ascending scale that fits more idiomatically in the piano, but creates a similar effect. Pletnev uses triplets instead of just 16th notes in order to create this. So it's a similar rushing effect, but with different notes in order to create that effect, because the original orchestral version just doesn't work very well on piano if translated literally. A fourth example is from the Adagio in Sleeping Beauty, and we're moving towards more and more creative reinterpretation of the orchestral color into something that's suitable for the piano. The orchestra part in this climax section in the Adagio is actually quite simple, but very bold. However, long held notes do not work on the piano because of the piano's decaying sound. The sound decays as soon as it's played. So Pletnev has to reimagine the fullest possible texture by utilizing rapid arpeggios and chords cascading up and down the keyboard in order to create the same level of sound. These loud areas are the areas where Pletnev actually exercises some of the the greatest amount of pianistic ingenuity and freedom is in these sections. So here's the orchestral part. And the notes are largely long and held, which works for the orchestra. So we can see that this is a grand climax for the orchestra. Pletnev takes this as an opportunity to write extremely virtuosic writing, which does not really resemble the orchestra part, but carries the same melody and the same level of volume. As I said, these are the moments where Pletnev is most creative, is when the orchestra is at its loudest, and therefore the piano has liberty to play as virtuosically as possible. So these first four examples show Pletnev in his role as pianistic transcriber. The last three examples will show Pletnev more in his role as a fellow composer alongside Tchaikovsky, adapting the piece not just for orchestra to piano, but ultimately from ballet music to concert hall music. It's here that the different aesthetic needs of ballet versus concert music play out more clearly. For example, this is the fifth example, in the Russian dance from the Nutcracker, Pletnev doesn't just come up with creative pianistic solutions, but ultimately develops entirely new variations on the theme that Tchaikovsky creates while preserving the original form of the piece. This highlights an important aesthetic difference between ballet and concert music for piano. In ballet, a certain amount of repetition without variation in the score is entirely permissible and even encouraged. On the flip side, concert music demands much more internal variety. Furthermore, in ballet, it is the physical skills and beauty of the dancers who are primarily being emphasized. In concert music, it is the musicians themselves who must show this high level of physical skill. This means that the common ballet ending strategy where a slow piece will end with a fast coda does not translate well, and Pletnev will always adjust the ending in order to maintain continuity. So we'll see that Pletnev creates variations where the original score has none in order to make a more striking effect in a solo piano setting. This piece essentially has the same theme over and over again with slight reorchestrations, but it's not substantially changed. Pletnev sees that as an opportunity to create pianistic variation. So those running lines do not appear in the original but Pletnev takes the liberty of adding them. My sixth example is the Tarantella, also from the Nutcracker, where Pletnev doesn't just add new variations, but actually goes so far as to add an entirely new counter melody to the theme, thus supplementing the piece with additional compositional material in order to create even more interest. This is Pletnev really inserting new creative ideas into Tchaikovsky's original score. Pletnev takes this piece as an opportunity to extend the piece through variation, and the counter melody he adds takes place near climax, where he adds a counter melody in the left hand. That theme does not appear in the original, but is a compositional addition by Pletnev. Last, I want to talk about the prologue to Sleeping Beauty, in which Pletnev is at his most free in terms of the arrangement of the piece. This prologue is the closest to a paraphrase of all of the movements from the Nutcracker and Sleeping Beauty suites. The prologue features Pletnev completely reimagining the form of the piece, and several sections are from different parts of the ballet and then reassembled to create the movement. The movement fundamentally is about the juxtaposition between the theme of the evil fairy Carabosse and the good lilac fairy. But those choices are really drawn from many different moments in the ballet. The theme of Carabosse happens at the beginning of the prologue. Versus the theme of the lilac fairy, which appears in the second half of the piece. So in that movement, Pletnev is providing not just a transcription, but really a paraphrase of his interpretation of the dramatic conflict in the ballet between good and evil, Carabosse and the lilac fairy. And he represents that through the first piece in his Sleeping Beauty suite. What all of these examples show are the ways in which Pletnev was a highly creative contributor in the transcription process and not just a passive copier of notes. This is so for two fundamental reasons. Because the original ballet must not only be transcribed from one set of musical instruments to another, from orchestra to piano, but ultimately from one genre to another. Pletnev adapted the music not just from orchestra to piano, which required his pianistic imagination and understanding of techniques for the piano, but in translating from ballet to concert, he had to exercise his compositional imagination as well and adapt transitions, create new endings in some situations, add even counter melodies and variations in order to draw out more interest where the original score may not have as much variation. However, these changes show that Pletnev regarded the original score by Tchaikovsky as containing material worthy of tribute and should not be compared to the changes taken by Liszt in his operatic transcriptions, which are much more free. Pletnev follows Tchaikovsky quite closely overall. The concert suites from the Nutcracker and Sleeping Beauty are thus essentially tributes to the musical integrity of the original Tchaikovsky scores on their own terms, and not just as material either for catchy themes to be taken out of context or mere accompaniment for dancing that doesn't stand on its own. Pletnev's transcription make the case that these scores can be readapted, but still preserve their value even in the new context of solo piano concert music. Thank you so much for listening and coming to hear my lecture recital, and I sincerely hope that you will enjoy the following performance of Pletnev's arrangements of Sleeping Beauty and the Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky. Thank you very much.